Hello and welcome again to yet another episode of This Week in Christian History. And we are focusing this week on a date in 1620. There we go, right? Which is actually the day that as we call them, Pilgrims left from the Netherlands that eventually ended up making it on the whole Mayflower trip. And as we talk more and more and more about America's founding and the 250th and talk about the early settlers and the people who came to America. Certainly, the Pilgrims, as we call them, are ring true from that. And we are so glad to have as a repeat guest Dr. David Hall, who is a retired professor at the Harvard Divinity School, who's going to talk with us. You visited with us, Dr. Hall, back in episode 17 that we did on the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, and
Oh, I remember
Reverend
that.
Hooker and all that was involved in that. So thank you for joining us again. We appreciate it.
Glad to be here. Glad to be with
Absolutely.
you.
Well, it seems to me just like a whole lot of good stories. Okay, what's the old adage? We never want to let the truth get in the way of a good story. But for us, truth is important. There are a lot of myths and misunderstanding or thought processes and mysteries maybe about really what happened at the first Thanksgiving and who the Pilgrims were and who they were not, and so we really want to kind of unpack some of that today. But tell us generally, as I tell my classes sometimes, keep in mind that all of the Pilgrims were Puritans, but not all Puritans were Pilgrims, right? So tell us a little bit about what a separatist is and what was going on and what they were fleeing from that drove them this direction. That's a big question, I know.
Sure. It's pretty straightforward to answer, though. So, when the Puritan movement arose in England in the late 16th century, it had a couple of major complaints, major goals, I should say. It was not a sectarian movement. It wanted to take over the Church of England and run it
Mm,
in a proper way. And that meant doing away with every scrap of Catholicism that remained. And there was a fair amount of Catholicism in the Book of Common Prayer, which was the official liturgy. And then there were bishops who were, from a biblical point of view, not biblical, I put it that way, come in later on in the Catholic tradition. There was no place really for lay people to have a participatory role in choosing their ministers, which was a Puritan demand. They didn't want the church to be headed by the civil monarch. They wanted it to be headed
mhm,
by Christ. So they had what's called in Calvinism, Reformed tradition, the two kingdoms theory. They're partners, but they're completely separate in terms of authority. The church has its church decides matters of doctrine. It decides who's minister, who's member of the church. It decides matters of liturgy. And in England, it was actually the monarch, who happened to be Elizabeth, Queen Elizabeth, in this period, who had the final say in all these matters. And she was not reluctant to weigh in on these things, by the way. So, so the Puritan movement was frustrated because of the political situation, and so frustration breeds restlessness, and
mm,
restlessness breeds why don't we just follow the injunction um, to depart from them that are unclean. That's a
mhm,
biblical passage which could be interpreted in various ways. Depart from them that are unclean and found our own autonomous churches. Now, church is a complicated word. It would be better to say, because it's better to use the word church for a national or a large institution. So we could say congregation or gathered church, something like that. We need a different set of words.
mhm,
So these things began to pop up in the 1560s, 1570s, 1580s, treated very badly by the government, which didn't like these movements. People were executed for saying this. A number of people flee to the Netherlands, where there's toleration and they can do what they want in the Netherlands. And so it's a recurring motif within the Puritan movements that a few people, not many, a few people are going to separate, the meaning withdraw from the official church. That's what separate means, separatism, and found their own churches. So this is, from one point of view, schismatic.
Mm.
It's breaking the fabric of Christ, of Christendom. It's shattering the fundamental unity of Christendom. And of course, all of Protestantism was, from a Catholic point of view, schismatic. But anyway, going back to the Puritans, so they're trying to hold on to the Church of England, but then there are these separatists who emerge in very small numbers. So then James I becomes the king in 1603 after Elizabeth dies, and he doesn't like the Puritans at all. He had experience with them in Scotland, so when he comes back, comes all the way down, travels all the way down from Scotland to get to London, he makes it pretty clear that he's going to defend the bishops. That's a famous expression: "No bishop, no king." Uh, and so there's another, as it were, little crisis about, do you obey the king or do you break off? Most people thought that he was enough of a moderate that they could work with him, but a few people break off, and they're in a particular part of England, eastern part of England, and they form their little congregations. Two ministers are involved who renounce their ordinations in the Church of England and accept new appointments by the local people. And then they're punished. They're going to be punished pretty harshly. So they get on a ship and they leave for the Netherlands. So they go to the Netherlands and they go to Leiden. And today you can go and still see the houses that they owned. And there's a little museum there for them. And then they're in Leiden, and things are not going so well. So for one thing, their children are learning Dutch.
Mm.
And they see acculturation creeping in. We're going to lose our very distinctive identity as a rule-bound, spirit-bound, Jesus-bound group of people if we stay, even though the Netherlands is Protestant, we're going to lose our particular identity. So by hook and crook, the government in England says, we're not going to bother you. Go ahead, leave for the New World. There's a group of merchants who say, we'll pay the costs if you're going over. And so the Mayflower leaves. It leaves late. This is very important to the story. Most of the ships coming to Massachusetts in the 1630s left in March or April. That meant they arrived in June, late May, June. The Mayflower didn't leave until late September, delayed by various circumstances in England. And so it arrived in November off Cape Cod. Now they had a patent, that means basically a gift of land south of Cape Cod, but they couldn't get their ship to go around Cape Cod because there's a complicated thing. So they turn north, and they end up in a bay called Plymouth, which has already been named Plymouth by John Smith. And they go ashore in November, and then they start to build their houses, and they settle in. Now the tragedy of that journey and the tragedy of the experience there is that when they left the ship, many of them had gotten pneumonia, the conditions on the ship. There were 100 people jammed on this small ship.
Because it wasn't just Pilgrims, right? I mean, so people.
No, they had hired servants. They had people like Miles Standish, who was a trained soldier, to kind of keep them sharp, and they had coopers, people to make barrels, and then they had the women and children, of course, too. So about just a little over half of them were from the Leiden congregation.
But there were other is that correct that the Mayflower also had other passengers that didn't have anything to do with the whole?
Well, no, they were all they were all part of the enterprise. They just were not. Let's put it this way: they were not a covenanted people as a whole.
I got you.
Some were covenanted, some were not.
Okay.
I mean,
so it wasn't like it was a ship for hire that happened to have a certain percentage.
No. This was not a ship
all separate.
This is the only time the Mayflower ever crossed the Atlantic.
Gotcha. Okay.
So they land, and so the tragedy is, they have to try to build a house. How they manage to do that in the wintertime and get a saw going, and it's just astonishing. Anyway, to come to the close here, half of them died. Men, women, and children died by the spring. So there are only 50 of them left by the spring. Now, this would have made most people go back on the ship when it left, but these are tough-minded people, so they stay. and they're determined to grow a colony. The next year, 1621, more people arrive from Leiden. So they gradually build up their community, and with other people coming. So I want to talk about the word liberty,
Okay.
because one of the myths about the Pilgrims is that they're one of the founders of our tradition of liberty.
Mm.
So we have to be careful here when we use the word liberty. It has all kinds of nuances, as you know well, biblical and non-biblical and political theory and practice. At any rate, so for them, liberty meant the Pauline motion, St. Paul's idea. One is liberty from sin,
Hmm.
and then that's salvation by Jesus, by the sacrifice of Jesus. But it also means for them liberty from the human inventions that Catholicism had created, not in Scripture, but still in the Church of England. So it's liberty from false doctrine and false practices in the Church of England. That's the meaning of liberty to them. They're going to be able to practice true religion as they understand it when they reach Massachusetts, when they reach Plymouth. Is that pretty clear?
Oh yeah, that makes
So
sense.
it's a very specific biblical theological meaning of liberty. It has nothing to do with civil society, nothing to do with governments or things like that at all. It's a very powerful meaning because it moved them to leave England to become separatists and to come across the ocean.
But
So
it's
then,
not the liberty tree that Samuel Adams would be hanging out under, right?
no,
It's
no, it's
not the
not that at
same
all.
kind of thought process
That's
as liberty
that's
as we're
based on
talking about the
Whig. That's
250th.
based on English Whig political thought. Yeah, exactly. So the second thing to say is about the relationship with the Native Americans. Now, there's a lot of ink being spilled in recent years about the relationship with the Native Americans. So uh, they came with their heads stuffed with images about who the Native Americans were. They'd never
Mm.
seen a Native American. And a lot of this was uncomplimentary to the Native Americans, I should say. They were barbarous. They lived outside civilization. They deteriorated. They were children of Adam and Eve. There was no question about that. But they were children who had gotten away from the ordinary rules of life.
Mhm.
So, but the good news was that almost from the day one, two friendly Indians showed up from the very small number of Indians on Cape Cod, living on Cape Cod at the time. One was named Samoset, who actually walked all the way from Maine. He heard about them, and he
Mm.
walked all the way from Maine, and he spoke English because he'd been taken captive and lived in England for a while. He was a sachem, actually, a leader, very, very experienced man. And he said, I'll help you. I'll help you figure out, how to get along with the Indians who were there, who were a different tribe. And then there was a man named Squanto. We don't know much about Squanto. He died pretty early, but he was the one who said, now you're going to have to grow some corn. Impossible to grow wheat in this. They didn't have a plow or anything like that. But corn, you dig a hole in the ground and stick some kernels in, and then you put some rotting fish in the, in the pile. And that's the fertilizer for the corn. And by jingo, it worked. So they're off raising corn. By the way, they were English. They never had eaten corn.
Huh,
Corn, by
I
the
hadn't
way,
thought about that. Okay.
corn is
Yeah.
corn is the English word for wheat. But here in America, of course, it's these kernels, which, by the way, are very, very nutritious. They're more nutritious than wheat. So Squanto did them a big favor. And then the local Indian sachem, uh, he was presiding over a very diminished group of Indians who had been hit by a disease. We don't know what the disease was, a European disease brought by passing sailors and fishermen. And about three-quarters of his tribe had died. So he was in a kind of a weakened position. So that was lucky. They were
Mm.
lucky in that regard. So instead of having a kind of fired up group of people saying, "What are you doing here?" They had a
Right.
very weakened group who said, "Maybe you can help us defend ourselves against our enemies to the west of us."
Mm.
That makes sense.
Oh,
So
sure.
there's a long period of peace, a very long period of peace with the Native Americans on Cape Cod, uh, growing out of these situations. Uh, but people could say that, well, they were taking Indian land, whatever. Whatever. You know, there are various nuances to this story. So then we come to early November of 1621, and so there's a feast, a harvest feast, and this in the 19th century got celebrated as the first Thanksgiving,
Mm.
and it got celebrated as a time when Indians and whites sat down together to a feast, and that's not what actually happened. It was not a religious service. Thanksgivings in English Protestantism were clergy called or church called, where you gave thanks for divine providence and so forth and so on. The Pilgrims were certainly thankful that they had survived the winter,
Sure.
but it was not officially a Thanksgiving. It was a harvest feast. And it's unclear whether some Indians sat down with them or not. And that, I don't want to try to settle that question. We'll never really know. The sources are unclear. So I do want to address one question here about the harvest feast. Do I have time to tell a story about myself?
You absolutely do. Hey, we want to make sure everybody understands we're enjoying a great conversation here with Dr. David Hall, and we're talking about facts and fiction and others, right? So,
in 1971, I had just arrived in Massachusetts to teach at the university, and I was invited to speak at a local historical society on the first Thanksgiving, 250 years. So about that time, I read a book on ritual theory. This is a lesson to all people listening. Don't let theory get in the way of the facts. So I gave a talk about the ritual significance of food to the colonists. And a hand went up after I finished. Dr. Hall, did they eat turkey the first Thanksgiving? I did not know the answer to that question. So my authority as a lecturer went out the window. So I retold this story in a piece for the New York Times in 2010 about Thanksgiving. And I said again, we don't know what they ate the first Thanksgiving. And I got email by the dozens.
wow.
You dodo. Don't know what they ate. So at some point in the 19th century, somebody invented a menu for the first Thanksgiving, and it's out there online somewhere. I never looked it up, but it was given to me. This is what they ate, you know. So it's a story. We don't know. It doesn't really matter what they ate the first Thanksgiving. You know,
Right.
they ate some deer. They certainly had some deer. They had some ducks. They probably had some shellfish. They weren't, by the way, great. They weren't great fans of shellfish. Anyway, so that's time passes on. So now I want to just go to one other story about them. So here in New England, we celebrate Congregationalism, capital C Congregationalism. There's a denomination. Actually, there are several varieties now today, America Congregationalism. And I attend a Congregational church which is 100 yards away from my house here in Maine. And so who founded Congregationalism? Now we know Luther founded Lutheranism.
Sure.
We know, John Wesley founded Methodism. So you have to have a founder. Who founded Congregationalism? And so in American congregational history, the Pilgrims founded Congregationalism because what they had was a covenanted church, most of the people who were faithful Christians, and the congregation elected the minister to office, and there was no supervising authority other than the congregation itself. In congregational theory, every congregation is independent. In fact, that's the nickname for congregations in England was independence. So the only problem with this story is that all of these same elements had been practiced by separatists before the Pilgrims came over. So you could say, well, in Massachusetts or in America, they're the first Congregationalists, but they didn't, as a theoretical, as a polity, as a concept of a polity, they're not the first to think of this way. It's at all. So that's it, and it doesn't really matter. When I go to a congregational church and I hear somebody extol the Pilgrims, so what? So, and one more myth about them: they didn't use the word Pilgrims for themselves. That's a 19th century name that sprang up to differentiate them So there's a very interesting, you would like this. So in the 19th century, the New England Congregationalists find that there's in their midst people called Unitarians
Mm-hmm.
who don't believe any longer in the Trinity of Christ, the Trinity and the divinity of Christ. And these are congregational churches, and because it's congregationalism, they can go and do whatever they want.
Right.
So this then creates a huge struggle for legacy. Who is the authentic Puritan? Who can claim the Pilgrims? So this is what led to efforts by the Unitarians to differentiate the Pilgrims from the Puritans to make them look like their ancestors.
Ah, okay. How
And
interesting.
you go to the Unitarian Church in Plymouth, the town of Plymouth, used to be congregational. And there's a great stained glass window celebrating John Robinson, who was the Pilgrim minister in the Netherlands and in England. He never migrated. And they celebrate him as a liberal thinker.
Hmm.
He was actually a hardcore Calvinist.
Oh,
So you get myth upon myth upon myth, layer upon layer upon layer upon layer. And if you ask me, does this really matter? No.
hmm.
It matters to a very small number of people.
Hmm. You mean on whether the Pilgrims were the real Unitarians versus the Congregationalists or not? Or
Yeah, right.
yeah,
There's no way you can turn the Pilgrims into Unitarians. There's no possible way you can do that.
sure.
But they because they didn't persecute anybody, they didn't they didn't just kill any witches. All that makes them look like a kind of kinder, friendlier, milder version of the Puritan movement.
Right.
And then you go one step further, and you say, well, maybe doctrinally they weren't so, whatever, whatever. There's no
Yeah,
evidence.
but you
There's no evidence for that in the 17th century.
sure. Well, you go back and ask Ann Hutchison or Roger Williams, they'll tell you about how kind they could be, right? I
That's
mean, so
right.
that might be a
That's,
that's obviously a different subject for a different day, but it is nonetheless connected to the whole
yeah.
idea about
No,
kind of
yeah. I mean,
who they were, right?
the interesting thing to say here is that when John Cotton, the great minister in Boston, when he came to defend liberty of conscience against Roger Williams, he said, as long as you keep it private, no one's going to interfere.
Right.
It's when you get on a public stump and start yelling about persecution, that's when the state is at least entitled to look into what's happening here and the consequences of your saying that
Right.
for the
As much
truth.
as you may believe the castle doctrine or not, right, Roger? You
That's right.
still are you still are
Yeah.
we're not talking about what's going on in your home, but once you cross that line, unless I
That's
guess
right.
you did that with Ann Hutchison though, but she was doing it in her
No,
home.
she was public. She was a public figure. She was very, yeah. That's another conversation here on Ann.
Right.
I'm
Well,
happy to have with you.
well, let's go back and talk a
But,
little
but
bit. Let's no, go
I
ahead.
want to mention one more thing: the Mayflower
Please.
Compact. The Mayflower
Yes.
Compact.
I was going to
So
ask.
this is a celebrated document, still celebrated, and so the Mayflower arrives, the ship arrives, and there's some people, as you've already pointed out, there's a number of people there who were not part of the Leiden congregation, so they're not a covenanted people. So the question comes up: the leaders, the Pilgrim leaders, say we need some kind of text where they pledge their loyalty to the group. Very important. We don't want to have dissension right
Hmm.
now at this moment. It's a real moment of crisis.
Hmm.
They could have fallen apart and
Sure.
become cannibals. They could have done anything. Anything could have happened. So the Mayflower Compact is a document where you basically agree, everybody who signs it, 46 people sign it, agree to accept the authority of those set over them. Now, this is a document that proceeds by consent, not by coercion.
Hmm.
It's by consent. That's an important thing. It's not imposed on anybody. You have to consent to it and sign your
Hmm.
name as a sign of your consent. So in that sense, it's not an authoritarian text at all. It's the opposite of an authoritarian text. No
Sure.
king is telling you you got to sign this thing. It's
Right.
the people themselves. But on the other hand, you are pledging obedience to authority. You want order. You don't want disorder. You want order, and you want your authority, your leaders, to have some basis for which they can say to people, "Look, you've signed the compact. Now we're going to do
Sure.
this." So that's another thing. Now you had a question or a comment that you
No,
wanted.
but that's kind of, well, Mayflower Compact was one of them, so that's good to be. But we can't say that it was a constitution of some sorts, right? This was an
No,
agreement within the congregation of like
right.
a congregationalist saying, hey, look, once we land and we get there, and I'm using my words, somebody's got to be in charge, right? We can't just all, have a group vote every time we want to decide where we're going to put how we're going to kind of function. And so do we all understand everybody agrees this is where we're headed is different than a set of laws that you're trying to lay
That's
out.
right. There's no law stated in the compact at all. Much later on, they do borrow actually from Massachusetts a set of laws. Um, yeah. So let me just recapitulate here. These are it's just to put it straightforwardly, it's a
Mm,
remarkable thing that these people
mm,
crossed and that they survived. I mean,
mm.
all the odds were against them.
Sure.
They survived, and they gradually grew, and then when the Massachusetts people came over in the 1630s, any surplus crops the Pilgrim people had were worth a lot of money, so they
Mm,
prospered because of the coming over of the colonists who were desperate for more supplies and so forth and so on. And so they begin to expand. They leave Plymouth. They found more towns, Duxbury, Sandwich, all kinds of towns around them, become a real colony of
mm,
multiple towns rather than, but they never have, to your point, they never have a charter from the king. Every other colony, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, have charters from the king. And that dictates, or the parliamentary government in England, that's Roger Williams, that dictates the form of government that they have. Plymouth is unique in not having a charter, never had a charter.
well, so fascinating on all of it. Let's go back to Leiden. The group that kind of left from England and went to Leiden and set up over there, there were still plenty of those separatists living there that were not interested in going to America, right? I mean, they
That's
still
true.
had their own community.
Yeah, no, that's true. When they made a decision who's going to go and who's going to stay, John Robinson stayed because the majority of the congregation was still in Leiden. He died there in Leiden. He didn't
Mm,
died in about 1626, something like that. At any rate, there were also other separatist communities in not in Leiden but in Amsterdam.
okay.
They go back to the 19th century, go back to the 16th century. So yeah, this is only a fraction of the larger, still small, tiny, but still only a fraction of the whole group. Yeah.
Yeah.
And by the way, downstream, your question anticipates this. Some of the people who come over later on aren't, of course, of a separatist background. They're traders. They're typical curious people just trying to get
Right.
out of England, whatever. So
Right.
integrating those folks is part of the longer story of the Plymouth colony, how they did that, and pressures on them, and so forth and so on.
And sometimes I think maybe the Plymouth Bay colony and the Massachusetts Bay colony, I should say, and Plymouth are separate entities, right? I mean, they start off that way. They end up differently,
1690,
right?
1691, there's a new charter put out by the king in England, and Plymouth has no political clout, so it gets
Right.
absorbed into Massachusetts.
In case you boys forgot that you didn't have a charter, now you do. Okay, so that's what's up. Okay, so now this is what we're living under, right?
Yeah,
Another interesting thought about that, and it seems to me that there are quite a number of people who love to be able to say or want it to be believed that the entirety of America was founded on the whole idea of religious freedom, and that's why we came here, and that's what our whole country is about. I think tell me if this is right or wrong. That's certainly the case for Plymouth, but there are plenty of other colonies that had nothing to, I mean, it didn't mean that they weren't Christian in general, right? But they were there was an economic development deal, right? I mean, it was a deal to be able to make money or to be able to sell land or to
Oh,
be able to.
absolutely. And that debate, that point of view. But let me go back to the root of what you
Oh,
just said.
yes.
So, and this goes back to the ambiguities of the word liberty. So the uh, the Puritans, they use the word liberty. Liberty from Catholic inventions, Catholic, anti-Christian stuff, this or that. They use it a lot, but they also have a very strong view of the church as a disciplining institution that says there's moral rules you have to follow, very strong
Hmm.
moral rules, and the state as an agent that will sustain those moral rules in some manner. Uh, and so um, you're coming over not to get free of any kind of rule. You're coming over to enact your kind of rules. And we
Hmm.
have to go back to Calvin and Geneva, where is a very strong set of rules, which these people have inherited. They're part of the Puritans and technically the Pilgrims too are part of the international Reformed / Calvinist tradition. It
Sure.
leads to the Huguenot, it leads to the Dutch Reform, the German Reform, all those Germans who came to Pennsylvania in the 18th century. Most of those were Reformed, founding of the Netherlands, Dutch Reformed. Uh, so you have to aggregate these in terms of polity. Most of them are Presbyterian. That's the alternative to Congregationalism. And in terms of civil government and so forth and so on, it's a very, very interesting challenge,
Hmm.
as you know, Nick, because you're speaking to a lay audience here, how to recognize that what happened, in 1789, 1791, is that we're a pluralistic society. I mean, there's Methodists, Baptists, all kinds of Baptists,
Sure.
Catholics, Jews, all around. Everybody, every pieces of all the whole panoply, not Eastern Orthodoxy, but the whole panoply of people who come over here from Europe by the Revolution. Just think about it. How
Yeah.
many different kinds I mean, Newport had the first Jewish church in the United States, Newport, Rhode Island. So you have to have a system that says all of those can practice their religion. That's very different from the Puritan point of view.
Hmm.
They didn't like the Pure Baptists. They didn't like the Anglicans. They
Right.
didn't. They hated the Catholics.
Hated the Quakers, right? I mean, they
They hated the
strung a few
Quakers.
Quakers up,
That's
didn't
right.
they? I
They
mean,
strung
that's
four Quakers up, including one of Ann Hutchinson's followers. So that's where liberty gets tossed around as a kind of casual word,
yeah.
and we have to think, but its meaning shifts when you have a pluralistic religious society. And just can I make one more point about this?
Sure. Absolutely.
So I
Please.
like to use I like to use St. Louis when I was teaching. So St. Louis had a lot of Germans came there. German Americans came. People came to St. Louis for various reasons in the middle of the 19th century. By the way, that was good when the Civil War came along because they all sided with the Union. If you're in Texas, but I'm in New England. So the Germans had their beer gardens. It's like the Scots in Boston right now. They're drinking Boston dry.
Sure.
And the descendants of the Puritans who were there in St. Louis said, "What do you mean we can't have beer gardens on Sundays?" So they completely different view of the Sabbath.
Right.
Completely different view of the Sabbath. And who is to say one is right and one is wrong? I mean, they were very religious, these German Lutherans,
Sure. Sure.
but they didn't have a strict view of the Sunday Sabbath. That's all. You know.
Right. Right. Right.
So
Right.
yeah, I mean, I'm not trying to say which is wrong and which is right. I grew up, by the way, in a Sabbatarian family, so we thought those damn Lutherans were, and worst of all, the Catholics.
But what about this idea of these, how many colonies and how much America was founded on the whole idea of religious freedom and the whole
Not
idea of
Virginia,
all
not
that?
not
That's just,
Virginia was purely economic.
yeah. I mean, the fact that Maryland was, predominantly founded by Catholicism or by, a Roman Catholic, it wasn't so they could practice Catholicism. I mean,
No,
that's not why they
no,
came
no,
over to do
no,
New Hampshire,
no.
right? It was It was an economic development deal, right? Hey,
Right.
let's
That's
look at
right.
these big tall
Right.
trees, man. These would
Yeah.
really make some great ship masts. Let's
Yeah.
go,
Yeah. Yeah.
get
Yeah.
whales or whatever,
Yeah,
right? I mean,
and as Cotton Mather once said, piety begat prosperity, and prosperity the daughter devoured the mother. So you also have changes over time where you have a merchant class emerging very rapidly, very, very rapidly.
right,
And of course, that's how the colonies survived. These colonies survived because of the merchant class who had credit and had buy things on credit in England or France or
sure,
Spain forever and keep place going. At any rate, so yeah, there's a sane middle ground here.
yeah. I mean, nobody is. I mean, it's not like people came here to because they wanted to expand on Buddhism or Hinduism. It's not like a matter of, it's not within a greater Christian heritage faith, greater, bigger kind of Judeo-Christian mindset. That's not what
Right,
we're saying. That certainly would,
right.
I
Yeah,
would think, have been the overwhelming supermajority of anybody that got a charter and that was trying to
that's
move
right.
forward. But, to say, we're
That's
trying
right.
to break away here and we want religious freedom and this is all based off of, by golly, Christianity, do or die. I just
Right.
don't know how we could say that categorically for
Yeah,
all of what
can't
would.
say that. Methodism was a revitalization movement. It was not a movement fired up by liberty. It was fired up by leading a moral life. It's a
Mhm.
revitalization movement initiated within the Church of England when it was kind of lifeless,
Yeah,
And John Wesley he was influenced by the Moravians, and he said we have to have a heart-centered, deep feeling form of religion, and that's what Methodism became in the 18th century, and it spread like hotcakes when it got here.
yeah,
It's
right.
because there were all these kind of lazy Christians hanging around, or people who weren't fully Christian, especially in the lower South, the upper South, because Anglican Church did a terrible, terrible job of sustaining vital religion.
Mm,
I don't mean to say that's generally true, but in Virginia, it was not a dynamic denomination in any way, shape, or form. So the Methodists came in, Presbyterians came in, Baptists came in, swept through Virginia
right.
like wildfire.
Well, that's
And
part of the whole First Great Awakening piece too,
it
right? Isn't
is,
that why
it is,
Whitfield and others were able to latch on in such a way
that's
that
right.
people were
That-
like, "Oh, we want to be fed,
That's
basically, of
right.
something that is going to help us, not
Absolutely.
just
And
kind
the,
of."
and the first way to feeds into the second Great Awakening because Wesley comes along really, the Wesleyan movement comes along sort of after. And Whitfield was part of that initially, but he dies in 1770. Wesley lives until the 1790s. He
Mm,
never came over to this country. So it's very, very interesting, these dynamics.
yeah,
I have to say, when you're teaching it, no chronology is crucial, and geography is crucial. European geography, and the geography of the colonies and later on of the nation. It's crucial. We have a very complex geography as a country.
right, right,
Uh, still see that, of course. It's still a very complex geography. And so it's hard to keep all that in mind because, and I'm going to go back to the myth making, and I want to just conclude here by saying that so New England was New England was kind of left out of the story, the national story, when Jacksonian democracy came along and the Midwest exploded with people and places like Kentucky and Tennessee and Alabama and whatever, all became flourishing
sure.
places. And, the country was, there wasn't a New England president after John Quincy Adams for a long time, a very, very
Mhm.
long time. So so one of the ways New Englanders compensated for their sort of losing political clout was to argue that, well, we were the real founders.
The cradle of
So
liberty, right?
we're the founders of liberty. And not only liberty, but also morality too, and all kinds of good things. And there was an annual oration in Plymouth. Right beside me, I have a book of these things. It's this thick, given where you can read these things, and these people are just making it up as they go along. Uh, but people believe that very, very, very deeply. That, you know, some people did in New England believe that very, very, very deeply, uh, and still do to this day, I think, in some ways.
Mm. And you think some of that, do you think some of that feeds or in or fit, or maybe the timeline didn't or the chronology didn't work enough, but does it feed into the whole idea of the first Thanksgiving and who the Pilgrims were and those other pieces
Absolutely,
of that, that
absolutely,
it feeds
absolutely.
that? Interesting.
You know, by the way, having written this piece for the New York Times on Thanksgiving, and when I talked about my faux pas, not knowing about the turkey, I got a request from a Virginia newspaper. Well, we actually had the first Thanksgiving in Virginia. Would you write a piece about Virginia's first Thanksgiving? So I had to look it up, see what it was. I'm a native Virginian, but I had to look it
Oh,
up to see what it was.
you weren't
And
sure you could keep your job, right? If you
I realized that in grade school I must have learned about this, but I didn't remember writing about it.
we have the same argument with several cemeteries in the South about who actually gets credit for a Memorial Day, and so they still argue that a pretty good bit, that who started those services first. So that's another argument for another day.
Yeah.
But that's fantastic. Hey, thank you so very much for taking some
Pleasure
time
to be
today.
with
We
you,
are
Nick, and good luck with your ongoing program here.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And for anybody watching and paying attention and would like to continue to follow what we're doing at the Center for Christian History, be sure to check us out on our website and all our socials and other places where we post about good information to help people learn more about Christian history and how they process that and how they are able to use that in their own lives. Thanks again.